When and where was the Bible made?
When was the Bible made?
Yeah, when and where?
When and where? Great question.
So, you're wondering when and where the Bible was made? That's a great question. And it's actually really important when talking about how reliable the Bible is. Some people might ask this question because they're skeptical about Christianity and the Bible's connection to God. But understanding the history and origins of the Bible can actually help show how trustworthy it is. So, let's dive in and explore this together. By doing so, we hope to share some convincing evidence with you and encourage you to check out what the Bible has to say.
Kids always ask questions that take 4 hours to answer. Okay, well, the Bible is a book that was written over 1,500 years by about 40 different authors who lived in many different places. So it started to be written by Moses, who lived about 1400 BC. So that's 3,400 years ago. Okay?
Okay.
And then many more people wrote it through Old Testament times. And the last person to write what we call the Old Testament was Malachi. Some people call him the Italian prophet Malachi. All right?
Yeah.
And then there was 400 years where nobody wrote anything. And then Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, Jude, and maybe a couple other people wrote books we now call the New Testament. And that was written from about, say, 40-ish AD, after Jesus died, to about 70 AD. So about 30 years, all the books in the New Testament were written.
Okay, that answered the question.
Great question.
The Bible, as we know it today, is a collection of sacred texts that were written by various authors over a span of many centuries. It is divided into two main parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament contains the religious texts of Judaism, while the New Testament focuses on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and the early Christian community. To understand when and where the Bible was made, we need to delve into the historical context and origins of each part. Let us explore this in more detail. The Old Testament. The Old Testament consists of a diverse collection of writings that were composed over a long period, starting around the 13th century BCE. These texts were initially transmitted orally before being written down. The majority of the Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew, with some portions in Aramaic. The various books of the Old Testament were written by different authors at different times and places. For example, the Torah, which includes the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is traditionally attributed to Moses and dates back to around the 13th century BCE. Other books, such as the historical books, the prophets, and the wisdom literature, were written by different authors throughout the following centuries. The process of collecting and canonizing these texts took place gradually over time. The final canonization of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh, is believed to have been completed by the 2nd century CE. The specifics of where the texts were compiled and edited are not entirely known, but they likely occurred in various regions of ancient Israel. The New Testament. The New Testament focuses on the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, as well as the early Christian community. The books of the New Testament were written in Greek, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean during the 1st century CE. The New Testament was composed by various authors, including the apostles and other early Christian leaders. The Gospels, which are the accounts of Jesus' life and ministry, were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The epistles, or letters, were written by Paul and other apostles to various Christian communities. The final book, Revelation, was authored by John. The process of canonization for the New Testament texts was a gradual one. By the 4th century CE, the current canon of the New Testament was generally accepted by the early Christian community, although there were debates and discussions regarding the inclusion of certain books. In terms of where the New Testament was made, the writing circulated among different Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire. The cities of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome were significant centers of early Christianity, where the texts were likely copied and disseminated. The Bible, with its Old and New Testaments, was made over a long period by various authors in different locations. The Old Testament was composed and compiled in ancient Israel, while the New Testament was written and circulated among early Christian communities in the Roman Empire. The process of canonization, or the recognition and acceptance of these texts as sacred, took place gradually over time.